topic is knowledge that effective instructors use. And our speaker is Tessa Andrews, and this is facilitated by Kimberly Tanner. Many of you may have joined us for her webinar about a month ago, which was also wonderful. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn things over to Kimberly.
Thank you, Sadala. So welcome to everybody to the second session of Online with LSE. I'm here as a member of the editorial board of CB Life Sciences Education, as well as the previous presenter in the webinar. And the goal of this webinar series is to provide a virtual journal club, a chance to have some behind the scenes insights into the education studies published in LSE, and a chance to ask questions of the author and understand their motivations and other aspects of the study that maybe don't come through in the paper. So please submit questions as we go. That was really helpful last time. And I will be facilitating and bringing in questions and as well as providing some previous ones that have been submitted. And I'm here with Dr. Tessa Andrews, who graciously agreed to be the second author featured in Online LSE. And she's going to introduce herself and talk about the motivation for study knowledge that effective instructors use. So I'll turn it over to Tessa and she can share her screen.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. Give me just a second to share my screen appropriately. Okay, can you see the slide? Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm very excited for the chance to talk with colleagues about this work today. I got to be a participant in the last Online with LSE, and it was really exciting to get to hear about the research from the author themselves, Kimberly in this case, and to hear some of the motivations and the thinking that you can't necessarily write about in a paper. And so I hope that, that we can have that experience today. Also, I'm going to talk about a paper that was published called Knowledge for Active Learning Instruction, Expert Novice Comparison Reveals Differences. And I want to start by acknowledging my collaborators. This was a big project and would not have been possible. Anna Jo Auerbach was a postdoc in the lab who really led this research. Michelle Higgins was a phenomenal undergraduate researcher on the project, and Peggy Brickman really helped us get up and running as we were developing tools for this work. None of this would be possible without them. Okay, so I want to start by, I'm really only going to talk for a short amount of time because I'm really interested to hear questions from the audience we have here today. Okay, so I want to talk just very briefly about ideas that motivated this work. I would say that the origin of this work and other work in my lab began when I was a graduate student, and I first encountered research that pretty compellingly indicated that students could learn a lot more in a class that moved beyond using a lecture-only approach. And yet I had taken a lot of science classes, and that was really the only approach that had been used. And so I became very interested in what it would take to support instructors to use these strategies so that all students had access to high quality learning experiences in undergraduate biology courses. And so this work and other work in my lab kind of comes at that question from different angles. This work in particular was part of my sort of beginning efforts to understand what knowledge and skills college faculty need to effectively implement evidence-based teaching. So not just to begin to use these strategies, but to really do so in a way that achieves the kind of promise of these methods that have been demonstrated in studies. And so we had some underlying assumptions that maybe don't come through exactly in the paper, so I thought they were worth mentioning here. One is that effective active learning instruction requires knowledge beyond content knowledge, which probably seems like a really obvious point to anyone who's tried to use active learning instruction or to support others in using it. But I think it's worth calling attention to because the majority of academia still seems to operate on the assumption that content knowledge is really all that's necessary to be a high quality college instructor. That's how we hire people and promote people. And so this idea that there may be really important knowledge that goes beyond content knowledge isn't really woven into how we train or support college instructors. But I think it's likely to be true. And then the other assumption that kind of guided the approach we took to this work was that what teachers notice and how they reason about what they notice would reveal something about their knowledge. Just like when we are trying to access students' knowledge, we can't open their head and look at it. We have to give them some task, see how they do, and then make inferences about their knowledge. And so we were drawing on wonderful work at the K-12 level that demonstrated that getting teachers to analyze videos was a promising way to access their knowledge and make inferences about that. I wanted just in really very brief to just run through the methods of the paper, just to maybe have it all on one slide. In looking back at the paper, I noted that we wrote quite an extensive method section. And so to kind of sum it down a little bit, the participants in this study were instructors who were using active learning in large biology courses, which we defined as 50 or more students. And they had to fall in one of two categories. They were either experts, what we called experts, and we defined that as demonstrated experience and effectiveness, which is very key to an expert-novice study. And the novices were not defined as someone who was ineffective, but rather someone who lacked experience and lacked evidence of their effectiveness. And so we have a little picture here of that's one of our videos from the lesson analysis survey we created. Participants watched short videos of real classrooms, and then they wrote answers to questions about what they saw that was working in the class and what they saw that wasn't working and maybe could be improved. And then we used a qualitative analysis of those text answers to really identify what are the ideas that are coming up for them, what knowledge are they showing us that they possess. And then we used generalized linear models to make some quantitative comparisons to see if there were any quantifiable differences between expert and novice knowledge in this study. And I'm almost done and ready to hear questions. I thought I'd just highlight, again, in a lot of brevity, the key findings. So we found that experts and novices differed in what they noticed as they analyzed lessons. So what was it that they were paying attention to when they saw a classroom? And in particular, experts were paying more attention to 4 different things. One was how the instructor was holding students accountable for working during class. Another was whether they were thinking about how the instruction kind of took into account the difficulties students were likely to have in learning specific topics. So what was hard about learning this topic, and did the instruction take that into account? They also paid a lot of attention to how the instructor monitored and responded to student thinking in real time during class. And finally, they paid attention to whether the instruction created opportunities for generative work, which just means work that actually asks students to produce something, produce an explanation, draw a graph, generate something. And then the second difference that we observed between experts and novices were that experts were better able to use reasoning to support their evaluations of the teaching and their suggestions for improving the lessons. And with that, I am going to ask Kimberly to bring us in with what I hope are some already arriving questions.
Yeah, so I'll just remind everyone that there's a Q&A box that you can put questions into, and I encourage everyone to do that. Nothing would be better if we had questions from everyone. And I'll just kick it off with a question. Could you share more about how you recruit participants for a study like this? Because I think sometimes people see a study like this and then it's unclear how you get them to participate. And could you say more about what kind of institutions they came from?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sure. I think that's one of the great challenges of human research is recruiting people to participate. And so we kind of took a multi-prong approach in this study. What was challenging about this study compared maybe to other studies I've done where we're asking students or faculty to participate is that we really did need people who met pretty specific criteria. which means that we actually interacted with a lot of people and even collected data from them in many cases that did not end up in this study, because kind of the crux of an expert novice study is that you have very clearly defined groups, kind of at the poles potentially of a spectrum of expertise, and that it is that comparison that maybe illuminates some of what's important. So we reached out to professional societies that we thought may have members who would meet our criteria. We used listservs and asked people to kind of self-nominate as well as to nominate other people they thought might be an expert or novice user of active learning. We didn't define that for them. We kind of let them self-define that, and then we use screening interviews to actually determine if people met our criteria or not. We also did things like, in this case, we thought, well, perhaps people who are using active learning are doing so because they were involved in some sort of grant-funded project. So we looked at the National Science Foundation grants that had been given in the last, I don't remember exactly how many years, but through multiple iterations, the IUSE program, which is improving undergraduate STEM education, and its predecessors, the TWOS and the CCLI program, for grants that specifically were meant to fund work in biology that would promote the use of active learning. And so we reached out to the PIs and co-PIs of those grants, thinking that they may have connections with faculty who are using active learning. We also tapped into some networks of instructors who we expected to be using active learning, like the Peer Learning Assistant Network, which is housed at UC Boulder, but has faculty all over the country. So we had to think a little bit creatively, and I'm sure the audience could propose additional ways to
and then the types of institutions? I mean,
yes, this is such a great question. We did not ask people to report types of institutions, nor did we, when we were looking for people, we did not exclude anyone based on institution type. So I can't say much about that, except for that we did ask that people teach classes of 50 or more students, which I suspect ruled out some community colleges and some liberal arts colleges, both of which sometimes pride themselves on having smaller classes than that. And so I suspect that most of our faculty came from research institutions and master's granting and PhD granting institutions.
All right. Okay. The questions are rolling in now.
Okay.
So
Wonderful.
grab some of them. And I'm going to do them in a slightly different order than they're coming in so we can sort of stick with the methods a little bit. So there's a question here that says, where did the videos that the participants looked at come from? And were those videos something that were made specifically for this study, or were they open source?
That's a great question. There are very few videos in existence at the time that met our criteria. So we wanted kind of what I might call a natural look at a classroom. We didn't want commentary or anything like that. We wanted a video that really made you feel like you were in the class watching it. So we had to make the videos ourselves. And so we made 3 videos for the survey. And then we realized that there was a lot of utility potentially to those videos. So we also created a freely available, we call it a video repository. So we made 7 videos in addition to the 3 for this survey that are freely available. The website is called Realize, REALISE, and it's our videos, plus we kind of curated videos from other sources that all focus on active learning instruction in large science courses. That's a great question. Videos were a barrier. We definitely had to make them ourselves.
All right, so related to, we have another set of video methods related question. It said, do you think what happened in the videos influenced the types of observations made by the participants and then the conclusions of the paper? And maybe another way to, my interpretation of that is, do you think if you used a different set of videos, you could have gotten different results?
Yes and no. So I'm gonna talk a tiny bit about a related paper that we published. So we there was so much wonderful data from this data set. And as I mentioned, there were participants who were not experts or novices who gave us awesome data we thought we could learn from. So we published another paper that used all of the participants that we had, which I think was like 77. And we created what we called a framework of pedagogical knowledge, which is sort of knowledge of teaching and learning. But the reason I bring that study up is that we looked very carefully at the video specificity of the knowledge that we elicited. So what I mean by that is there was some ideas that only came up in response to one video, or 90% of the time they came up, they were in response to a single video. And so that indicates to me that that is very much about the video, and it may be an idea that instructors don't use in their own teaching, but they thought about it when they saw that video. So we had a few components of knowledge that we elicited that were very video specific, but everything else, including the 4 things that were different between experts and novices, crossed the videos, which meant that people were mentioning or kind of revealing this knowledge as they analyzed each of the 3 videos. Not that everyone noticed it for everything, but if we looked across the videos. So that gives me more confidence that those are ideas that would have come out had we selected other videos. Mm-hmm. But the point is an excellent one because we're using particular stimuli and that raises particular ideas in people's minds. To build on that work, we're now investigating knowledge instructors bring to their own teaching. And so it's premature for me to say what we're finding, but what I do notice is that some things are coming up more than we saw them in that study, and other things are coming up less often. And so we may ultimately be able to weigh in a little more on to what degree those components were results of the video.
I think it's just beautiful, the methods you've set up, because I think if different stimuli can elicit different things, and you can make comparisons. And I think even having people reflect on their own teaching versus watch a video of themselves would be fascinating. Okay, one more methodsy question, then we'll move on to results. And this one also, I think, relates to the nature of the stimuli. It said, what class levels in the study were being targeted? Juniors and seniors, grad students? Maybe I'm misinterpreting the question, but I think it's like, were these intro courses or upper division? And then related to that, how long was the study? 1 semester, 1 year? I'm not sure, but maybe something about how long it takes to do a study like this would be helpful.
Sure.
Sorry, Tessa.
Good question. So there was a mix in the videos. So 2 of them were introductory. There was 3 videos that we asked them to analyze. 2 were from an introductory course, different introductory courses, and 1 was from an upper division course. And those are really important questions for a variety of reasons. So I'll just give one example of that. So I still have the slide up, I think, about the planning for topic-specific difficulties. So you don't need to know what PCK is, but if you do, this is an aspect of what's called pedagogical content knowledge. And one thing we noticed was the video of an upper division class was cellular biology, and most people did not reveal PCK about upper division cellular biology, presumably and we asked, most of them don't teach that. And so we would not expect them to have a lot of insight about what's difficult for students in learning a topic that they don't teach and may not. I'm an evolutionary biologist by training. I understood little of what was happening in that particular lesson. But the other topics were, I think because they're at an intro level, they're accessible to maybe all college biology faculty, and people were more likely to have taught those topics themselves. And so those 2 videos was where we really saw people reveal their pedagogical content knowledge. So that question of level has some real implications when you're talking about teacher knowledge about teaching and learning specific topics. All right, so then the second question is a good one. So I'll maybe answer it in 2 parts. So first of all, the semester timeline wasn't necessarily important for our study because we were just emailing people, doing a screening interview with them, and then asking them to complete this survey. And so it was a one-time point participation. But the sort of larger question of how long a study like this takes, we sort of don't want to think about it, but starting from the developing of the videos, which was quite time consuming, to refining the survey questions. Also, we went through a variety of data collection whose sole purpose was to refine the videos and the questions, as well as our analysis of that data. So we probably collected data from 30 people that you will never see in a paper because it was helping us refine our instrument. And so from start to finish, maybe 3 years.
Yeah, research with humans takes time. So thanks for sharing. All right, so there are a couple of questions that I'm going to try and read and put out because they're related, and they all have to do with how to define a novice instructor and an expert instructor, and then whether or not that has to do with experience. And so I'll just read a couple of them. So let's see where to go. Was the novice group exclusively instructors who were new to teaching and, capital and, to active learning? Or could the novice group include instructors who had had many years of teaching experience but had only recently started use active learning? I'd love to hear more about why you chose to define the novice group as you did. And so I know that you have lots to say about that. And then the other related question is, did your analysis start to disentangle transitions between novice and expert? In other words, were there intermediate regions of the spectrum? So if you could talk more about that, how you would go about defining it, and if you have things besides the pulse, that would be great.
Sure. Those are really important questions for this kind of work. I'll start with the novices. So first of all, we were defining experience with using active learning instruction in a large class. And everyone had to have used it for at least a year. So we didn't want people who were like in the middle of their first semester of teaching an active learning course, because we felt like having a little bit of experience under your belt was important for you to be able to think about someone else's active learning classroom. So there were participants who had quite a lot of teaching experience, but were quite new to using active learning instruction in a large class. We opted to take that approach rather than thinking about just sort of raw years of teaching experience, based a little bit on that assumption that I laid out at the beginning, that there is knowledge that you would bring to bear in an active learning classroom that is quite distinct from what you need in a traditional lecture classroom. And so if we take that assumption as true, which is an assumption at this point, then it is primarily your experience with active learning instruction that we would expect to contribute to the particular knowledge that we are looking for. And I'll say one more thing about that, because I can imagine audience members thinking, but you learn so much from your years of teaching, which I completely agree with. And I think that's not to be underestimated and is a really interesting research question. How much of sort of knowledge built from teaching experience in a more traditional sense can be translated and sort of capitalized on as people transition using active learning instruction? I don't know the answer to that. I do notice some things in work we're doing now, that things like pedagogical content knowledge, which, just to give you one kind of snippet of what that might mean, if you're teaching the topic of natural selection, let's say, understanding what prior knowledge students are likely to have about that and the particular difficulties they will encounter as they learn about natural selection, that's harder to learn if you primarily lecture, because you're not necessarily getting a lot of access to student thinking. So some of what we're finding is that perhaps the active learning methods help you build particular types of teacher knowledge because they give you more access to student thinking, for example. getting off track on what the other question was. Can you remind me?
Yeah, no, it was, are there intermediates between
Yes, okay. Without question, there are. And that's something that's hard about this research. It's not that every novice looked the same and every expert looked the same. That wasn't true. And I suspect there very much are intermediates. Although I will say I would not hypothesize a one-path trajectory from more novice level of knowledge that's relevant to active learning to a more expert level, because I suspect and have some beginning evidence that there may be multiple entry points by which people arrive at wanting to use active learning, and that then that knowledge really drives how they choose to do that. And so I think there are many, many open questions, and I think investigating knowledge for teaching among college faculty is a really important and totally wide open area of research right now. And I think an excellent question or set of questions is, how do people, what sorts of knowledge lenses do they bring to their active learning instruction, and what might those trajectories look like? So I believe the trajectories exist and that there's a variety of them, but I don't have data to reveal what that is yet.
Yeah, lovely, lovely. Okay, so here's another question, and I will say that I think the balance of the questions that we have are going to be having you sort of make some predictions about what this would mean for people who are working with faculty, and so the application of this, and we'll get there shortly. But one other question that sort of relates directly to the paper is, to what extent do you think the types of expertise, the 13 categories that you have, would apply in other disciplines? So to what extent is sort of this framework, do you think you would get a different set of insights if you did the study in other disciplines?
Yes, I'm dying to know the answer to that question, and very excited to try this particular instrument, this way of collecting data about teacher knowledge with people in other disciplines. But I haven't done so yet, and so I have no data to inform that question. I suspect that a lot of it will be very similar. But what exactly will be different, I don't know yet. We saw a lot of thinking about in the creating opportunities for generative work. One set of ideas that fell within that category related to engaging students in sort of scientific practices or competencies in class. And I hope other people in other disciplines will chime in, because I'm probably wrong about this, but I wonder if there's more emphasis on that in biology because of vision and change, which clearly laid out competencies as a priority. And so I wonder if we might see that to a greater extent in biology than we might in other science or STEM disciplines. That's kind of one component of the 13 that I can imagine possibly being different. So I don't know. I suspect a lot of it, on the surface, a lot of it seems to have relevance across disciplines, and a lot of it I would categorize as pedagogical knowledge, so knowledge about teaching and learning that's somewhat generalizable. It's an open question how generalizable it is, but if it is in fact generalizable, then I can imagine it having relevance in other STEM disciplines.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we're about halfway through our time, I would encourage people to have the questions keep coming, but I will say I have several questions, and they are all very similar, and so we're going to move into sort of the application of the findings of your work. So I'll read like a couple of them. Do you have ideas for training faculty to become more expert in their management of active learning based on your study? Someone else says, what are your chief recommendations for people mentoring new faculty or setting up active learning workshops? So what do you sort of take away from this that you can give as advice to other folks or that you've integrated into your own work with faculty?
Yes, I feel sort of woefully unprepared to answer that question, partly because as a researcher, I feel like I've barely scraped the surface of this topic, and that there's a lot more I need to investigate before I feel confident making any sort of edicts about like, this is the knowledge you must have to be effective. I think this study provides a lot of interesting and important ideas, but that we need more research. So I guess that's my disclaimer at the beginning. I would say it has made, I think, one important frame of mind for people thinking about supporting faculty is a starting place might be the recognition that there is knowledge beyond content knowledge that's likely to be really important, and that many of us as college faculty have had perhaps insufficient opportunities to develop that knowledge. And so seeing faculty as learners, I think, is a crucial sort of starting place for faculty development. And that there are, I guess, a secondary idea would be that there may be some sort of principles of teaching and learning upon which practices that we refer to as active learning instruction, things like a think, pair, share, there are principles of teaching and learning on which those are built. And I think we may do faculty a disservice if we focus on how to use active learning at the expense of some fundamental knowledge about how people learn and why particular strategies or approaches you might use in the classroom are really crucial to facilitating learning. So I feel like we're seeing people in the knowledge about creating opportunities for generative work. If I had to distill that, it's sort of knowledge of constructivism, that people build knowledge themselves, and that instruction must take into account what they already know and give them opportunities to build their own knowledge, and they don't learn by hearing things. And so I think something we saw in experts is some deeper knowledge about how human beings learn that they then could apply in a variety of ways in making instructional decisions. But I think sometimes we focus more on come learn about clickers or come learn about think, pair, share. And perhaps that gets people in the door, I don't know. But I think us thinking about them as learners and thinking about perhaps the more fundamental knowledge that underlies practices is really important. I would say, Kimberly, one way you phrased that question was sort of, how might this have changed my thinking about things? And I would say what I noticed is I think it amplified some thinking that I already had, but maybe I didn't recognize the importance of. And that, I would say, is just the how critical student thinking is to teaching, and the absolute importance of me as an instructor understanding what students are thinking, as much as I can, understanding that before I ever arrive in class and planning based on that, but then also getting access to thinking in real time while I'm teaching, processing that, and responding to it appropriately, which is really hard. That's a really challenging undertaking, and I, as an instructor, fall very short of that most of the time. But it's helped me appreciate that maybe at the end of the day, if I had to boil it all down, it's really just all about student thinking and me understanding student thinking and creating opportunities for them to work with their own thinking.
Yeah, I had a wise person once say, oh, we used to focus a lot on what we teach, which I think is important. That's a conversation we need to always return to. And then we've moved to how we teach, which is kind of the getting people in the front door, like, here's how you do a pair, share, clicker. And really fundamentally what we always need to focus on is who we teach, which gets to not only student thinking, but who's in the room and inclusion. So there were two comments that built on those previous ones about, well, what should we do with faculty, which I think is the burning question in the Q&A box. Two people brought up really interesting ideas about, and I'm going to abbreviate them, how can you develop faculty's attention to these different components, like holding students accountable or monitoring and responding to student thinking. And then the person says, I ask in part because I had to watch and analyze videos as part of my teacher preparation courses. And there's actually videos like this themselves have been used a lot in pre-college teacher preparation. And another person asks, sort of more in a methodological sense, do you think watching and analyzing the videos influenced how your participants view active learning instruction? So maybe you could sort of speculate a little bit on the use of videos as a way to bring attention to some of these issues.
Yes, I'm so glad someone brought that up. I was definitely motivated in deciding to use the video analysis approach by some of the phenomenal work that has been done at the K-12 level, not just to use videos as a research tool, but to use video analysis as a learning opportunity for instructors. So I guess I would say broadly first, how to develop instructors and support them to consider these different components is a really complicated question, and there's definitely more than one way to be successful at that. And I think as a community, thinking about developing college instructors in science or in STEM more broadly, we have a somewhat impoverished empirical base on which to build compared to all of the work that's been done to understand how K-12 instructors can be supported to develop. So I think that there's a lot of research to be done, but I think we would be woefully remiss not to draw heavily on what's been learned about K-12 teachers. And I would agree that some of the more compelling evidence I've seen about developing K-12 teachers in service and pre-service is video analysis. So there's a project called Stella, which is through the, should have got my acronyms sorted beforehand. It's through BSCS, and I'm not going to be able to tell you what that stands for right now, but it's a group that focuses on biology education at the K-12 level. And Stella is a professional development program for teachers where they participate for a full year and they learn to analyze videos. First, they learn to analyze videos of other people's instruction, and really they're given lenses by which to do that. So they're have the kind of structure and the facilitation, but they're meant to be focusing on student thinking. What are students thinking first, and then developing toward thinking about how are instructor actions influencing student thinking in this context. And then eventually they get to the point where they're analyzing their own teaching. And similar models have been used by other groups in math education, what they call a video club, very similar premise. First, you learn to analyze other people's instructions with very specific lenses. So that gets to the question about how do you get faculty to learn in this way or pay attention to these components. And one way is to say, we're going to watch these videos and this is where you're going to pay attention to, and to practice that over and over again. And then eventually getting to where we're looking at our own teaching that way. And there's some pretty impressive results in what teachers pay attention to and the kind of knowledge that they possess and their instruction in the classroom being much more student focused and aligned with sort of, they don't talk about active learning like we do in the college level. But so that was the first question. The second question was whether I think people actually were influenced by being asked to analyze the videos. I don't really know the answer to that. What I can say, though, is it was more common for novices to make comments that indicated they were surprised by something or got a good idea from watching the instruction. Or one video that we included is a pretty phenomenal example of instruction. And it was more likely that novices would say sort of like, I have nothing to add. This was amazing. And so I don't know. We didn't go back and ask them later, so I don't have data about whether they learned. But I suspect that they may have. And part of our motivation for creating Realize, the repository of videos, was we felt like there's not a lot of places someone could go and just watch a video. And there seems to be a culture in many institutions, including my own, where we don't really go watch each other teach. So you maybe don't get a real life opportunity to see this in action either.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. That we had one of our faculty talk about learning communities as being making teaching a spectator sport, where you actually go and your job is not to critique, like different than the study. Your job is to like take great ideas and be inspired and to then walk away, right? Because people can. I was actually super impressed with people that were willing to be videoed, right? And it's very brave to be in a study like this. So. Let's see. We have time for a couple more questions. If you have more questions, keep them rolling in. There's one question that, once again, I think I'm not sure you have data on, but I think is a really lovely thing to hear you speak about. It says, how much of the application of these findings depends on the person's skills, whatever that means to you, and can anybody implement these findings in the teaching and learning process? And so it's sort of a more detailed question about, well, how do we take this to faculty? But what are your thoughts on, can anybody be focused on these issues?
Yes, that's a great question. So, and that really gets at this distinction between knowing something and being able to apply it in practice. And I think anyone who's spent any time thinking about it knows that those are two different things. And we are well aware of that also. And especially that you might even be able to notice something and reason about it if you hadn't given it all that much thought before. And so I certainly would never argue that someone revealing knowledge to us in this means that they're definitely effectively implementing that in the classroom. And so I think an important next step, this helped us understand, well, what different components of knowledge should we maybe be paying attention to in this context? And now we're trying to look more closely at what knowledge people are actually using in their own teaching. And we definitely see that there are instructors who can speak with some sophistication about some principles of teaching and learning, for example. And then when we see them teach and we ask them to tell us what they're thinking while teaching, using video of them teaching, that they're not being very successful in enacting that. And so no, I think that there's definitely a distinction between knowing things and being able to enact them in the classroom. And the classroom even makes it simplified, because different students are different courses are different institutions are different. So even if you were very successful in one context, there may be a learning curve in a different context. So I don't know that I have a lot of insight into how to think about that exactly, but I think it does emphasize, I talked earlier about how professional development or support for instructors should have an element that focuses on perhaps these kind of principles of teaching and learning, but I would definitely not argue that that alone is sufficient. I think then being able to have practice enacting that and getting feedback on that repeatedly, which is exactly what we are trying to do in an active learning classroom with students, right? Give them practice with the things we want them to be able to do in a structured, supported way, and feedback will be critical to actually being able to enact that knowledge. And some of the knowledge we found was much more logistical in nature, sort of how they were paying attention to how what maybe seemingly small things were structured, not because that's critical to learning, but because that supports what is critical to learning. So kind of the logistics of active learning instruction were things that people were paying attention to also. So I think something like a sequence where faculty first practice thinking in a certain way by analyzing videos or analyzing student work or going in and watching each other teach, and then started thinking about how to make that happen in their classroom, with the idea that it was all a learning process and that it wasn't going to go great the first time, and that then they could kind of collaborate to rethink ways to enact what it was they were aiming to enact. That's probably a long process. I don't think you probably learn to be a really effective active learning instructor in a large course in a short amount of time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, and it strikes me in what you say that we emphasize feedback is so important in learning with students, and yet that's the place I think in my own work I've really struggled, because there are peers, right? And so if you're not invited to give feedback, like how do you get that feedback to pay attention to those structural details that can kind of make things go or not go?
Yeah.
All right, so we have about 8 minutes left before our sort of final 5-minute sort of assessment round, and we have some questions coming in. I'm going to take these last two questions. It says, semi-related, but I think it's highly related. I was surprised that 79% of your participants were women, and I also noticed that everyone you listed as researchers for this study were women. Why do you think there is a trend for active learning users, at least your participants and deeper researchers are women? Thanks for answering, Tessa. Every question.
I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I could speculate, but it feels potentially unkind. Those are maybe different questions. I don't know. I mean, this is a question I think requires more thought. I think we see a lot of female instructors who care very deeply about their students. But when I say that, I immediately think, well, that doesn't mean male instructors don't care deeply about their students. So I wouldn't argue that that alone is driving things. It's probably I can imagine other factors like identity, professional identity. Women may be more comfortable being identified as someone who spends a lot of time on their teaching than male faculty are. So I would suspect there are multiple factors interacting to contribute to what I think are real differences potentially in the degree to which people are trying to implement active learning. As far as DBER goes, I mean, that's quite well aligned with education research more broadly, and again probably has some complex societal underpinnings related to sort of what is valuable work for whom. I definitely was somewhat disappointed that we had such a overrepresentation of women. Not that I don't appreciate every woman who is willing to participate, but that's not ideal considering that it's unlikely to be representative of the whole population. But I haven't found the same pattern as we're starting to collect evidence in people's own classrooms and about their own teaching. We had many men willing to participate, which is excellent. So I don't think that particular gender bias is going to plague this sort of research in general. It's a hard one to end on.
Well, yeah, and so sometimes it's great just to surface those questions. Let's see, one more question here. Where did it go? What if anything do you know about how the instructors got this expertise? So that relates to people who are sort of asking you to speculate, but to what extent was there anything that experts had in common or that was different than novices about how they happened to have gotten this set of expertise or pieces of it compared to the novices?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I can tell you some things that is not how they got their expertise. So everyone had similar backgrounds in terms of having a PhD in the life sciences. There was wide variability in how many years of teaching experience, just writ large, people had in both the expert and the novice category. So that alone didn't explain differences. People also, our sample had participated in quite a lot of teaching professional development, which I think probably makes them somewhat different than just a random sample of college biology instructors. But again, that didn't explain differences. We saw, I think, more experts who had led teaching professional development. The problem is we don't know if that's a cause or an effect, right? Are they asked to lead it because they are understood to have expertise? It probably also helps build expertise. I certainly find that I learn things in a deeper way when I teach them. So it probably is both a cause and an effect. We had also quite a number of education researchers in our sample on both sides, novices and experts. But I do still suspect that engaging in education research may contribute to the kind of expertise that we were seeing, because I think you learn more about, for example, theories of teaching and learning, or theories of how people learn, and maybe you're more aware of, for example, research on what students find difficult about learning particular topics, or different ways that people might approach teaching a class. I don't think that means everyone needs to be an education researcher, but it could allow us to kind of query, well, what knowledge might those individuals have that we could help develop among faculty more generally. But yes, as Kimberly mentioned at the beginning, I don't know yet, but I very much want to know how people develop this particular expertise.
Yeah, and I will say that one of the questions, because we had a lot of fabulous questions, so thank you. This is a great webinar crew, because I have so many questions here, and I apologize I can't get to all of them. But one of them specifically had said, to what extent do you feel like the deeper sort of knowledge or expertise is brought on by either offering or participating in professional development? So that came up in the Q&A. So maybe sort of the last kind of question, you can take some time with this, is we see these papers published in LSE, and it was so gracious for you to kind of say, oh, this is the 3 years worth of work and a lot of piloting. There's a lot of data that we won't even see in this paper, which resonates very much with my experience as a researcher. So where do you go next with this research? What can you share in terms of what you're in the middle of doing now, and kind of the kinds of questions you're trying to answer going forward based on your findings here? Sure,
thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So as I have mentioned a few times, I really want to know, for me, there's kind of two places you absolutely have to go next after this work. One is we need to know what knowledge people are actually using as they plan, implement, and reflect on their own teaching. So we've refined an approach to get at that. Again, really drawing heavily on approaches that have been successful with K-12 teachers. So we are using an approach now where we interview a participant before they teach a class period to really get at their thinking before the class. We film them teaching, which gives us insights about their instruction, as well as serving as stimuli for what we call a post-instruction interview, where we use a method called a stimulated recall interview, where we choose clips of the class period that we watch with them, just short clips, and we say, tell me everything you're thinking in this moment. And you've probably all in your personal life experienced the phenomena, but if you can kind of go back to a place where you thought of something, you can think of that thing again. And this provides a similar sort of reminder for your brain, and instructors can then tell us things they were thinking right there in the moment that if I had asked them without the video and the audio, they may have struggled to remember. So it helps illuminate what kind of thinking are you doing in the moment when you're making instructional choices. And then also what are your reflections after the fact. And so that is giving us very rich data about the knowledge that instructors are actually bringing to their own teaching. It creates a tremendous amount of data, so we're slowly working through that. And it will help speak to things like pedagogical content knowledge, which we saw a little bit in this study, but we wouldn't really expect to see much if we're asking people to comment about topics that they don't teach. So this gives us more insight into how much what pedagogical content knowledge has been repeatedly shown to be really important in the K-12 world. But there are very few studies of it in the college setting. So we're getting at that to a greater extent. And it's helping us to see, of these components, are we seeing those being used in actual classrooms? So I think that's a critical next step. But then a step that I think is even more important, we just have to take this step to get to the final step, is starting to look at the relationship between teacher knowledge, teacher practice, and student learning outcomes, which is really hard. And the expert novice approach was our first approach to that. So we were relying on people having collected data in their own class or using a very expert approach. But what I would ultimately like to do is be actually measuring student learning in classes and then looking at the knowledge that contributed to the lessons that the students experienced on the topics that we're measuring their knowledge and what their instruction looked like, to start to put the pieces together to better understand what the connections are between those things. And then do that longitudinally so we can see how people's knowledge changes over time. So that's like the next 20 years of my life.
That's your career.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you for sharing. And I will say several of the things that Tessa shared that are next steps that she's studying in that sort of middle study were questions, related questions that I wasn't able to get to, which is, you know, how would the data have been different if you did think alouds with these folks, right? As opposed to having them type. And so it sounds like for the person who asked that question, like, lovely question because it's coming down the pike. So the very last thing I'm going to ask Sedella if she can share a slide. Sedella, are you there? Our last slide, we're going to just spend these last couple of minutes. We're big believers in evidence collection and assessment. And so if you would not mind, I have going to your chat window. And please share one thing you learned during the webinar that will influence you going forward, so we get some sort of sense of what people are taking away from the webinar. And we really, really appreciate you taking just 1 minute to type something out for us. We'd really love to have everybody have one thing that they submit. So it'll be quiet for just 1 minute, and then we'll say a final word of close and one more question. And that's in the chat window. All right, I appreciate they're rolling in. Keep typing, keep putting them in the chat window. Even if people have to go, we're able to archive these, and so Tessa and I and LSE will be able to look at them later. So thanks for everybody to submitting one thing you learned that will influence you going forward. And then as that's happening, I just want to give you a heads up. Once again, thanks, because this would not be intriguing and so successful without having all these fabulous questions. I've really enjoyed facilitating. This has been super fun. And we want to let everybody know to mark your calendars. Then third, next Online with LSE, Friday, November 9th, same bat time and place. Dr. Mika Estrada has a lovely paper, The Influence of Kindness and Community in Science Education. And in the sort of structure we have going, Tessa Andrews, who's been very gracious sharing with us as a researcher today, will be your facilitator for that webinar. I will certainly be there submitting my questions on the Q&A. And thank you so much to Tessa. It is such a luxury to be able to talk to people about their work in this forum. So I'm really appreciative of LSE for setting it up. I hope everybody has a great Friday. Sedella, do you have any last words?
No, I don't. Thank you guys so much for participating.